The Western Conference Finals are set, and of course, I don't have to remind Suns fans that, of course, Phoenix did not make it. But these are the teams the Suns are going to have to beat to get there next year and beyond. What can we learn from what is working in the NBA playoffs on the Western side of the bracket? We'll break it down, as well as how the Suns can hopefully get right back into it next season. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 7 seasons, and the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen to kick off your Tuesday. The Suns offseason rolls along. If you're finding us for the first time, or you just haven't done so before, go ahead and hit that follow or subscribe button on your podcast platform of preference. Get a new episode in your feed every single Monday through Friday. We're free and available everywhere, including YouTube. So really, hit it. Hit the button now. Off-season content all summer long. Get locked onto the Phoenix Suns right here as we see what this Suns roster will look like and do this all again in the fall. Joining us as he does every single Monday, well, we're recording on a Monday at least, is Brendon Dueñas. He is a writer over at Bright Side of the Sun. And we have a lot to get to because there's pretty much, a youth movement happening in the NBA, Brendon, and 3 of the teams, I believe, that are in the Western Conference Finals, 2 didn't make the playoffs last year, 1 didn't make it past the first round, and then, of course, the Celtics are kind of the favorite lurking here. We're going to stick mostly on the West and just talk about, okay, Minnesota was a little better than we thought. Does that change how we felt there? What are the trends? What's working? What's winning in the Western Conference? So we'll get right into that. Today's show, guys, brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right. How do you feel about the Minnesota series looking back now that they beat the defending champs, Brendon, and are headed to the conference finals for the first time in 20 years? Do you feel better about how it all played out, given that the Wolves were better than we thought?
No, I do not. They still got swept. It'd be one thing if they showed a little more fight, but no, I do not feel any different. I think the Suns still got their butts kicked, and they have a lot of work to do on that front, but I do feel slightly less embarrassed in the sense of, at least it's to a team that, it wasn't a blip. Like if Minnesota goes and gets swept by Denver, that's a different story. I think there'd be more embarrassment, but no, I'm not going to take any moral victories, and I don't think this Suns front office will either. I think the thing we've learned the most about the NBA this season is that narratives can change very quick. Dallas missed the playoffs last season. Minnesota's Gobert experiment was a failure, one of the worst trades of all time a season ago. The Suns need to take that and not get comfortable, but just realize that they could do the same thing with this team. They have that talent, but how are you going to get the pieces to make that a reality? So that's kind of where I sit overall, big picture. But man, that Minnesota-Denver series was one of my favorite series, and since I'm talking Warriors, Cavs, peak.
Yeah. To me, it's been those Warriors Rockets series were some of my favorite. And this felt not style, but just heavyweight clash. It felt very similar. But yeah, I don't think anybody in that Suns front office is taking a moral victory. I don't think anybody's getting comfortable. They have a lot of work cut out for themselves. And yeah, okay, the Wolves are a little bit better, and so yeah, the blip word you use I think is a good one. It wasn't just some lucky break, and frankly, you could look back at the past 3 eliminations that the Suns have had, and each time that team went pretty far, proved themselves. Now, with the last 2 years it was the second round, so of course that team had to even get to the second round first, but last year Denver wins the title. The year before that, I think Luka and the Mavs have kind of proven that was for real. They're back there again now. But the reason that I don't feel good about it in any, no matter how I slice it, is you look at the 4 teams that got further than the Suns this year. Whatever you want to call it. You could say 7 teams got further. But they're all teams that have now eliminated the Suns, right? Denver, Minnesota, Dallas. So you could say they don't really match up well with any of those teams. And then Oklahoma City owned them throughout the whole regular season. So you could easily make a case that the Suns are like the 5th team in the West right now, even if you feel like they're better than the other teams that lost in the first round. And the other thing is the way they lost, and they just got overwhelmed physically every year. It's that wing tandem of Finney-Smith and Bullock, and even Kleba as kind of a big that mucked things up in 2022. You got, both Browns and Gordon in 23, and then obviously like McDaniels, Alexander Walker, Anthony Edwards this year. They've just gotten they've had it taken to them just with size and force and athleticism, and that's a big concern because I don't see a lot of answers there when I'm looking at this roster.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say it. They lack those like dogs. They lack the just physical, athletic, in-your-face players, and I feel like that's been a problem for quite some time now. Even their finals run,
James
right?
Jones doesn't seem to prefer those guys, right?
And look, it is tough to find playable players that fit that mold, given some of their cap restraints and all that. I get that, but you could still take some swings on certain guys that maybe are like a great value version of that. It just seems like they, in general, avoid those types of players. But to me, I think that's kind of the main ingredient, and that starts with the draft. That's where you could find a lot of those guys that you're not going to hit on all of them, but they had one of them and traded one of them to Portland. So there's a lot of them, and not DeAndre. We're talking about Kamara here, just smaller scale.
But I honestly like not to get hung up on Kamara because whatever, he never even played a game here. But I think the reason that I think it's hard to find those guys is less so that they're not available, because I look at some of the names I just listed, whether that's Alexander Walker, Bruce Brown, Reggie Bullock, Maxi Kleba. Those guys were all bargain bin dudes. Those guys were not like number one picks. So I think they're there. You even look this year at some of the other teams like, Derek Jones Jr. or, I guess Peyton Watson, Christian Brown, those guys were draft picks. That kind of sits with what you were saying. Kelly Oubre in Philly. Like, it's harder to find those guys that are two-way players is what I would say. I think you can find them for cheap. I think the struggle, like we've seen with Okogie here in Phoenix, is can they play both sides? And I'm not sure Kamara could have. So that was a roundabout way of getting back to Kamara. But that, to me, is the problem. It's like, I don't really think Kamara would have played here because I don't think he can shoot. So it's pretty tough to find guys who are actually playable deep in these playoff series.
Yeah, for sure. And just even circling back to just the offseason, like Keita Bates-Diop is potentially supposed to be that guy. And look, a lot of people love the offseason the Suns had, and I think they took some swings that, they all didn't work out, and that sometimes that happens. You just got to move on. Like when you don't have the resources to make more aggressive moves, like I think given what they had and the options that were there, they truly did probably the best they could have, which is both concerning, but also on a positive side, this, like I've already kind of talked about earlier, is like on one of our previous episodes, is like I think some of the candidates that fit that mold make a lot more sense and fit a little bit better than I think last summer. And now they just got to go out and get them. That's really what it comes down to. And hopefully, they fill their roster out a little more complete and just can hit on at least one of those swings. That's all you need. You don't need to every minimum guy you sign is not going to turn into the next big thing. But if you could just get one guy, then you're cooking.
That's exactly how I put it. I basically, I did my full offseason preview episode for Monday, and I'm like, if you can add one playoff caliber, proven two-way player to your rotation this offseason without removing any of the ones you already have. They could trade some of those guys, but I just mean total number. Go from if they had 7, go to 8. And I think that's a success. I don't care how you do it. I don't care if it's the 22nd pick. I don't care if it's a 2-for-1 trade. I don't care if it's a free agent signing. Get one more guy and retain everything you already have. And I think you're feeling pretty decently at the very least. Now, who that guy is and what position, I guess that's where we can all differ and debate it. But That's kind of all you really have to do when you do have a roster that has talent like the Suns have. But one other smaller note, just because we're going to get into more of the roster stuff and this, what are they missing and everything as we go. But one little thing is, I think what gets lost, because people like to say big threes don't work in the NBA anymore. And I think the reason people say that is because the league's so deep now, talent-wise, and that's true. But I think part of the thing the Suns have run into is analytics, coaching. That stuff has also come so far that whether it's like the personnel evaluations that we were just hitting on with what James Jones seems to like and not like, shooting more threes, which is something he does like and this team didn't do, that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg to me. The other stuff that a lot of these types of players we're talking about that they do is really where this stuff can get decided. Forcing turnovers. The Thunder are awesome at that. Offensive rebounding. Dallas just beat them by being awesome at that. Transition scoring. Pacers, you could say. I know that's not in the West, but those things really matter, and you kind of have to be able to shapeshift with how many great teams there are in the league. So I think that's another reason big threes don't work is, and I'm not saying this one can't work, but that perception being out there is because just having teams built around scorers like that, you miss out on so many of these other elements. So that's where you have to nail the stuff on the margin. So let's get to that stuff. Let's get to how this big three can still win. If maybe, I don't know, it can still win. We'll get into all of that coming up next. First, today's show brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more this spring. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 straight to your account to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. I believe the Western Conference Game 1 should be up now. It wasn't the last time I recorded. Yes, it is. Minnesota favored by 4 at home. Maybe feel good betting on... I don't really know who Suns fans are rooting for here in this series, if I'm being honest. I would like to see if I could make a little bit of money on the overs in Indiana-Boston, personally. The pace is going to be crazy. Those are two great offensive teams. That's what I'm looking at. But FanDuel has you covered beyond basketball, beyond those bets, all across the spectrum. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Brandon, let's keep it rolling. So I want to remind everybody to check out Locked On NBA all playoffs long, daily breakdowns of all the biggest games as the playoffs roll on. And again, talking about those teams, part of why I still hold out hope for this roster, Brandon, is I think you still do see, like, it's basketball at the end of the day. Shot making wins out. Shot making matters. It's the least replaceable thing. The Suns have the most of it. I still believe that. But kind of piggybacking off of some of the trends we talked about in that last segment, size and defense matter more, I think, right now than they have in a really long time in the NBA. You know, like since maybe Shane Battier started playing power forward and Chris Bosh started playing center. Like, we're talking 15 years almost of this era of small ball ruling everything. And Denver, Minnesota, it's hard to imagine that you can win being tiny anymore. And the Suns don't have a lot of that either. Just bigs, big forwards, big guard. They don't really have size at any position. And I think that's something they really need to address.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about having, a center. It's about, just like you said, positional size. And that's the key, I think. And there's just that general overcorrection of the small ball era that I think really changed how people think about like roster building and roster construction in general, to where that overcorrecting went way too far and bigs became undervalued. And I think you're starting to see that curve flatten out a little bit. And I think that small ball era, while there still are moments where I think, and especially in a playoff series with matchups and all that, like, it's still very valuable. But if that's your only option, if that's your best option, you're probably going to be in trouble against certain teams. So I think roster flexibility is huge, and that doesn't mean just going small. It means let's go big. Let's use this size advantage in our favor, but also have the ability to go small. So I think that's the main part. And if you could figure out a way to how to blend that as well as a team like Minnesota, even Denver's kind of an anomaly, right? Because they have Jokic. Like if they could kind of throw anyone around him and they're going to make it work. But I think Minnesota is a great example of just having that positional size, and even if you're oversized, like if you have the talent, it's gonna work, and it's gonna take time. I think that's the thing. I said this throughout the season is the last thing Suns fans want to hear, but even with the big three, like it's not even about months at a time. It's like years sometimes to really form that chemistry of being familiar with one another, and that's what we're just gonna have to bank on, is hope that they A, stay healthy again come playoff time, and B, can just continue to gel and click with one another.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes to me when you just zoom in on the Wolves, it goes back to the shape-shifting concept to me. Like they've won games in this postseason with Gobert out, closing with Towns and Reed. They beat the Suns multiple times, playing Towns was on the bench to close games, and Alexander Walker was out there basically going small, even though Rudy we think of as he's a traditional center, but McDaniels is not a four, in like the 1980s version of the NBA, and they won that way. They won with Conley out and having to go even bigger. They play Reed, Towns, and Gobert sometimes, not for long stretches, but they do it as a change of pace option. They just can be a lot of different things, and that the Suns didn't have that, and if their kind of go-to stuff wasn't working, as we saw in the first round, they didn't really have that plan B, C, D. The part of why, and one of the other things I think I look at is depth. And I mean, I just got done saying adding one rotation player would be like a huge win. That's not a great way to come in next season being the deepest team in the league by any means. But I mean, again, Minnesota's kind of an anomaly given how many of these like second round pick type guys they've been able to hit on. But at the same time, like, would Naz Reid be the fourth best player on the Suns?
Depends on the day. There's nights where he might be the second best. But then
Yeah,
other nights where he's probably
like
the 10th best. Yeah.
Yeah, fair. But like, I mean, again, even if we just say, okay, Minnesota is a little bit unique, like Al Horford, Sam Hauser, Dallas has the Suns would have loved to have Dante Exum or Josh Green or Derek Lively. Like, are you kidding me on this year's team? Even Christian Brown, like the Nuggets are thin compared to some of these other teams, but they're deeper than the Suns, So to me, it's more certain, like just watching some of this, it's more obvious than ever to me that wing and center size has to be the priority over a point guard, over putting too many resources into a point guard. And if their one big swing was just to get somebody who's 6'2" and can defend only one position, I don't think that's going to solve what's wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of it comes down to, like you said, just resources and how many boxes can you check with just going for a small playmaker that takes the ball out of your best player's hands. And look, I don't want to diminish the value of a point guard because there is definitely value there. I'm not trying to diminish that at all, but looking at this specific roster, I think its ceiling is going to be hit through doing the things the big three can't do. And where are you going to find that? That's size. And that's exactly. So to me, that's why I think I totally agree. I think that's a priority. Obviously, in a perfect world, they check all the boxes. They get everything. But reality of the situation is it's going to be very difficult to get that, at least at a high level. And that's why it comes back to, can you hit on one of those vet minimum guys and then also make a good trade and acquire using that pick and Little's contract to get, like you said, just a certified playoff rotation player. We're not talking about like some like superstar. We're not Lakers fans here daydreaming about the next star in a Photoshop Lakers uniform. Like we're just trying to. You
might not
someone.
be, but Suns fans online seem to think that's still a possibility. I don't know I don't know what more to say, guys. It's not happening. Like I just tweeted right before we logged on my list that I went through on Monday's episode of my top 10 like minimum targets. And just to be clear, when I say wing, like Chris Dunn is at the top of my list that I went through. He's more of a wing to me at the end of the day, just in that he's not a primary shot creator type of, yes, okay, he's called a point guard on the starting lineup graphics on, Bally, it'll say that, but he's not like, that's not really a point guard to me in the same way that like Trey Jones would be. But anyway, I tweeted that list out and people are like, you got to be kidding me. I'm like, I don't know what these are the names. I don't know what else you want me to do. I can't control who's a free agent and who's going to make what amount of money. This is just kind of what it is. And yeah, maybe two rotation players. Is that a better goal? Am I being too limited with saying one?
I think 2 is definitely possible given the resources they have in terms of like, you should be able, if you can't flip a first round pick and Little's contract into like a player that's playable, then that's a problem. In addition to that, if you could go hit a swing on one of those vet min guys, then that's a pretty easy pathway theoretically to getting 2 more. But again, it takes 2 teams to trade, and not everyone's going to just, be lining up to come to Phoenix. Like, I mean, there could be some role players that could see it as an opportunity, but I think just finding the right players is a lot more difficult than some people think, just on the surface level.
I mean, hopefully it's not still harder than people think. We just saw it happen. I mean, last year, like you said, people were pretty high on the Suns offseason just in terms of being able to get some talent in the door despite not having a lot of money to offer, and yet they got a half a player. I mean, Eric Gordon, I wouldn't even count as being a full, consistent difference maker in the rotation. It was, every other night it seemed in the regular season after the All-Star break, and then in the playoffs, like, what do you have, like 1 good game out of 4? So they got half of one guy with like 8 swings last year in free agency. So, the way to getting 2, I think, is you nail one signing and you do get the trade to work out, or you make the pick maybe. I mean, I'm still holding out hope they might make the pick. I don't think they probably will, but they could. And there's names there that I think could, Derek Lively's making an impact. Kassan Wallace is making an impact if you want to go through, again, what's winning right now. But, all right, I want to actually hear I'll put you on the spot a little bit, but it feels like you have a name kind of, or an idea with the Little contract. I want to hear what your favorite trade there is as we look toward next season a little bit. I have a list of some teams I think will be better, some teams that might take a step back. We'll answer the fun question in May of the Suns are the blank best team in the West right now. I have that prepped. We'll get into all of it coming up. First, today's show brought to you by PrizePicks. Get in on the playoff action. Win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks this spring as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during basketball's postseason. Can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as few as 4 correct picks, turning $10 into $1,000 with basketball, hockey, and baseball entries today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. What I love about PrizePicks is you are not playing against an opponent, not playing in a pool, not playing in a league. It is just you versus the PrizePicks player projection, and of course you can combine. So I watched Caitlin Clark because there was no NBA playoffs tonight. I just got to sit down and really soak in her one competitive game so far. That was very fun. The assists are always going to be the one with her, so you're going to go more assists there. Maybe you go back to the NBA for something else. Maybe you go more rebounds for Gobert. That's an easy one, and you just watch the money come in. You don't have to beat anybody else out. Download the app today. Try it out for yourself. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA when you make your first deposit to get it matched up to $100. That's the PrizePicks app or PrizePicks.com. Promo code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, Brandon. So if you didn't have one, I gave you about a minute there to come up with one. Nasir Little is making $6.3 million, if I have that number on the tip of my tongue like I thought I did, on draft night, and I goes up a little bit starting on July 1st. So there's all sorts of combinations of what they could do there. Who's your favorite target when you think about Little plus that pick to get that rotation guy that we're hoping they can find?
Yeah, so the targets I had more ready or prepared, I guess, would be more along the lines of like trying to find that center in like a bigger trade. So like someone like, whether it's Clint Capella or a Brooke Lopez being reunited with Coach Bud. The draft day trades definitely I would need to look more into like contracts that fit that sense. But I did like your Chris Dunn example. Someone like a Mason Plumlee is another name that I think to keep
Free
an eye on.
agent-wise. Sure.
Yeah, free agent wise, and then DeLon Wright and Monte Morris on the smaller scale. But I still think center is the weakest point of this team, and to me, whether it's unloading Nurkic's contract or even little in that pick, just finding someone that could take that, close out the game at the 5. That's the biggest thing for me. So those are the first two names, were Capella and Brook, that kind of jumped out. Reunite Brook with his old coach.
I have some bad news for you. I don't think there's a way for them to get those players. How are they going to get those guys? They make more than Yusuf Nurkic, and they can't take back more money than they send out. How would they do that? You sound like the people in my comments, Brandon.
Correct. I was under the impression Capella made less, but I stand corrected.
Capella makes 20, so he's just ahead of where Nurk would be, and it turns into 22 on July 1st. So, yeah, it's a tough spot. I mean, I think center-wise, if you're looking for trades, like the names that I have on my list are Brandon Clark, Nick Richards, Al Horford, potentially, although the Horford one's a little weird because I don't know why Boston would get rid of him, and he makes like a lot less than Nurkic and a lot more than Little, so they're good. That doesn't, yeah, it's not easy. Goga Bitadze, that's who I'm dreaming up right now. Just give me the minimum signing that I know can actually come over to the team. But
Goga would be great. That would be.
You've talked him up before, right?
Yeah.
I think you've mentioned him on the show. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, but speaking of some of these other teams in the West, not the ones we've already touched on who are in the conference finals, but the others. Just off the top of my head, before we know anything about what's going to happen this offseason, Brandon, I have Oklahoma City, Memphis, Houston, and San Antonio all getting better just from getting older. Mm-hmm. And Memphis more so just by getting healthy, I guess, a little different for them. But they'll be back. Yeah. The Thunder, Rockets, and Spurs will just be 1 year older and better. And I only really have the Clippers taking a clear step back. Just like obvious, like, Paul George could leave, that would make them worse. Other than that, I don't have like this team will just clearly not be as good as they just were this season. Maybe some are going to stay the same, or they were never good enough in the first place. Like I think the Suns are better than the Kings. I'm not worried about the Kings, but I also don't think the Kings are going to fall off a cliff. So
yeah.
4 teams ramping up, only 1 team maybe ramping down.
Thoughts on the Warriors?
Means it's going to get harder. I think the Warriors could go either way. I think they have a big offseason, interesting offseason, but as they're currently constructed, I don't think they're as good as the Suns anyway, so I wouldn't be super worried, but they could get a lot better if they take a big swing, and then that would add them in there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's just a team I'm keeping an eye on them, and then I think Denver even could do some interesting things. Like I wouldn't be shocked if they try to get Porter out of there or just did something creative to just move the needle. So the West, like you said, a lot of young teams, a lot of great talent. Like it's a gauntlet. It was a gauntlet this year, and it's only going to get more difficult next season.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, yeah, the Nuggets are obviously, losing like they just did. They're going to have to look at some things, and Michael Porter Jr.'s contract is very big. KCP, I believe, has a player option. He'll have offers out there. I would not be surprised if he opted out. Gordon has an extension coming up, and on and on. But I think they're better than the Suns kind of either way. So, with that all said, the Suns to you right now are the what best team in the West?
I would keep them in that 6th spot at this point. I think they're a fringe play-in team. It really just depends on it's so tough because like obviously we have to see what they do this offseason, but as things stand now, I would kind of keep them where they were. It's going to be a lot more difficult to even stay in the 6th seed. Like that's a team, like that's the thing that makes the regular season, like they can't take it off. Because if they do, they're going to find themselves in the play-in.
Yeah. I mean, and unfortunately this year it wasn't even really their choice. Beal just kind of doomed them in that way, but that's tended to be the trend lately. So if you're talking about how do they creep up even more, it's like, well, do they have to have maybe even another trustworthy guy on top of what we've already talked about just to protect themselves from those injuries a little better? Like, I don't know. Or is Bud and the habits that he's been able to instill in his teams and even in the role players on his teams, is that maybe enough to say, hey, those minutes in the early season when Jordan Goodwin and KBD and Little were just sucking, maybe under Bud, that those types of guys play a little better and you're not quite as bad. I mean, maybe that's the value coaching can have, but I had him fifth, just with the logic I already spelled out of like, okay, let me take the Clippers out of there.
Yeah.
And then there's 4 teams that otherwise were already ahead of them in the standings. I'll leave them there. But I had Memphis and New Orleans as the 2 primary teams kind of looming. I think the Grizzlies are for real. I know they just like fired all their assistants, but I think they're well coached. I think they're very talented. They were competitive. I mean, the Suns fans don't need me to tell you that the Grizzlies were competitive this year, even with the injuries. And then the Pelicans, I think, obviously had a nice showing down the stretch of the season, and they could trade Ingram and get better. They could trade McCollum and get better. They could get a real center in the door instead of Valanciunas. I could see them easily being even more competitive next season if Zion can stay healthy again. But, that easily, like you just said, if I'm saying they're 4 with 2 teams looming, that could be 6. That could be 7. And they're right back to fighting for their lives in March and April again. So, yeah, they got a lot to do here, and they have to stay healthy, and all these other things. So, cheery note. Happy May, everybody. That's how it is. All right. Lots to get to throughout. We'll hear more news. We'll hear more names they're linked to and all that. But this week's all about setting expectations, getting our ideas flowing, and that was a good one. So that'll wrap us up. Read Brandon and the crew over at Bright Side of the Sun. Hit follow, subscribe here if you haven't already to get another episode tomorrow and every day of the week throughout the entire off season. And I'll catch you guys next time.